everyone, and welcome to Heart and Hand Rangers podcast. This is your extra show for the week. My name is Cammy Bell. It is a pleasure to join you, but it's my pleasure to be joined by Mr. Break Glass in case of emergency, Martyn Ramsey. Martyn, thank you so much for coming on, and what I'm certain will be a fun-filled pod where we're going to talk optimistically about the future.
Yeah, emergency would indicate fast action and urgency. I'm not sure those are words associated with this particular week in Rangers land, but yeah, always a pleasure to be on the air with you, Cammy.
Yeah, Martyn, I used to hate international breaks because I don't really have an affinity to international football. And I was kind of looking forward to this one, firstly, because Rangers had made an overdue decision in binning Russell Martyn. And the managerial hunt was beginning. And I was kind of thinking about this show in particular because last week, and let's call it, I don't know, foolish optimism, naivety on my part, that I would be talking about the new Rangers manager. Because that person would be confirmed and in place, and we would be talking about the highs and lows of it. And here we are on Thursday, the 16th of October, and Rangers still do not have a new manager in play. Martyn, we've discussed this a lot on our Patreon site, but you've done the smart thing by leaving the country and having a well-earned break. But I'm keen to get your thoughts just generally before we start getting into the candidates who have stepped out of the running in terms of where things are at the moment. The best way I can really surmise it is it's a complete fucking bin fire.
Aye, that's pretty succinct. Look, Rangers disappoint you. Everybody's football club does. That's the nature of the game we're in. I'll be honest though, relative to hope and expectation, I'm not sure I've been as disappointed by anything like this takeover. It just, from a theoretical point of view, just ticked so many boxes. There's wealth there. There is some kind of sporting pedigree and background. Leeds fans that I know, Leeds fans online, their assessment of the time spent there is a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth around some of the early decisions, but they held their ground. They stayed steadfast to their plan, and they had a brilliant season last season and are punching okay in the early stages of the Premier League. And that kind of detachment, I've certainly used the phrase adults in the room, I think was something I really wanted to see, because we were far too emotionally led, understandably, before. It's just the nature of wealthy fan ownership, I think. And this was a break from that, and next step, retail operations, perhaps redevelopment, all the rest of it just seemed to be, the next phase. And it's just pretty much been a disaster from the get-go. And just this lack of preparation, Cammy, to be honest. This wasn't a kind of overnight deal. It was months in the doing, as they always are. And I don't think it was an unreasonable assumption to make that guys would be in under the bonnet, seeing what was needed. I know gardening leave applies to Kevin Thelwell, but come on, let's be realistic. You would expected him to be doing a lot of work. That extensive manager search that we were told about, you would have expected sign-ins and player profiles to be a huge part of those discussions. And we met with Kevin Thelwell and Patrick Stewart. This wasn't off the record. This was on the record. It's on the Patreon site on Russell Martyn's unveiling. And he kind of said something along the lines of, well, the work starts now, and we're going to discuss later this afternoon options with Russell and player profiles. And like, why has this not been done already? And there's always that kind of sense of, right, we've got this bit sorted now. We look at it. This is stuff that should have been done ages ago, and that's been a huge disappointment. I know people have said they've underestimated Scottish football. Again, this reliance on championship players, blah blah blah. I think there's a bit more nuance in that. I wouldn't so much say underestimated. There are 3 European competitions on an annual basis that tell us how shite Scottish football is, but they haven't understood the dynamics here. They haven't understood the dynamics of this club and what this club faces, and the noise. And they've used a lot of theory and a lot of practice that's been successful elsewhere and simply applied it because that's what will work here. And that's a huge disappointment about successful guys, thorough, I presume, in their other interests, and it just hasn't been applied here. And yeah, this is kind of where we are. And even on this break, I don't think it's probably out of the question to assume that the owners flew in last week pretty much expecting to shake Steven Gerrard's hand and move on. And they didn't. And now they have been scrambling about. And scrambling, we're going to talk about the options, Cammy. The options that were there, no longer options in some cases. But they have been scrambling around between, I guess, 2 points. One, holding their course. All right, Russell Martin was the wrong choice. Kevin Thelwell may well be the wrong choice. But this plan to implement a more expansive attacking structure, set Rangers up for the long term, not just fight fires on a weekly basis, because that's really what we've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years. And, come hell or high water, they will keep to that line. And they've gone from that to, what does follow think? And that's hugely depressing, to be honest, because that way leads to just, again, not being able to see beyond your nose. And pretty much they tried to hold that line, they fucked it, and now it looks like they've bottled it. That's my assessment of the last wee while.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The situation, as far as I can see it, with regards the takeover, and I think it's fair to say we're going to talk a lot about sentimentality and some nostalgia when we discuss what we were looking at as potential options coming in and who the preferred candidate was amongst the Rangers fans that I think, both you and I know, and I think across the vast majority. But the reason why I talk about sentimentality is really just there's this, ray of light at the end of the tunnel that we felt that we had towards the tail end of last season. You're totally right. I think, we went through the course of due diligence, which I think began late October, November last year, in terms of the potential takeover, and then obviously everything gets ratified. And I think you and I had spoken previously that the concern of the old board was that they were too close to the fans in terms of what the fans wanted and how to be able to give the fans what they want and stay true to some of the values of the club. And whilst that's admirable in some ways, it can lead you in wrong directions in others. And I was keen on a board being able to come in, run it more like a business, have it a bit more streamlined. I don't think a little bit of emotional disconnect is a bad thing. But what effectively has now happened is it's went full tilt in another direction. And people will talk a lot, and you kind of mentioned it there about that level of preparation. I can't find myself subscribing too much to the theory that, following Bruges, for example, at that point, the club, and I'll use that in the kind of widest possible terms as to whether or not you want to talk about Kavanagh or Parag McGatt, or whether or not you want to talk about Patrick Stewart, Kevin Thelwell, should have been going out to look then for a new manager, for a replacement, because I think it's exceptionally difficult in the modern world to be able to do these things in the QT. It can be done, but it's difficult. And Falkirk obviously was very much the kind of final straw. So I struggle to believe that there wasn't a list in somebody's notebook somewhere that said, for a little bit of disaster recovery, if these results and performances don't get better, when can we get rid of them, and who would we have as our kind of dream picks? And that has probably, for me, formulated part of the recruitment process that we've been going through. What we on now, probably pretty much the last 7 days, and this is where it has felt like there's never been that launch that we wanted from the takeover. The guys have come in, and I was at the EGM with Kavanagh and Muscat and all that, and they were talking about, their visions and what they wanted to be able to see the club kind of get on to. And you could tell, and these guys aren't daft, right? Of course they're not, because they could understand these things will not happen overnight. And I also don't think Rangers fans felt that they were going to happen overnight. But there's been a series of milestones from then to now, which I just don't think have been met. I don't think in any way they have been swift enough in their decisions. I think that the optic is bad. When we had the open letter come from Muscat and Kavanagh to say, we will be taking a key role in the recruitment process, how much that devalues or undermines Kevin Thirlwell's role, I think a lot of fans started to put two and two together there, because ultimately, as far as we're led to believe, they're not involved in this process to any great degree. But this was the opportunity, and I feel like I mention that word a lot on some of these pods, that we had the opportunity to correct some of that wayward misdirect, I suppose, on get a manager in, get a deal done, understand the likelihood of that preferred candidates' desires. What do you think that they'll need? What do you think that their specifications will be if they're going to accept the offer? And really, from last Thursday across the course of the weekend, and even up until you and I recording this, it just seems like there has been a real lack of purposeful urgency to get a signature and to get this done and to be able to get it. And as we're recording at the moment, Stevie Smith has now been announced that he will be taking the team against Dundee United at Ibrox on Saturday. And I think that's a situation that none of us envisaged. It's just felt like we're stumbling from mistake to mistake at the moment. And it's hard to quantify why.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to know the ins and outs, really, wouldn't it? And maybe in the course of time, all that comes out. I go back to my assumption, and I don't think it's an unrealistic one, Cammy, that the owners flew in last week expecting to shake Gerrard's hand. So, and it wasn't a decision made after Falkirk. It almost certainly was a decision made before Falkirk, regardless of how that game turned out. I, again, don't think that's unusual. I think clubs quite like to use the international breaks. Some of them actually do use it to get someone in and get a bit of time when it's possible. We seem to have used an international break to not do that, which is a novel approach. But, clearly the Gerrard thing was very, very, very far down the line, to the point that preparations were being made to, come in, what's this, what's happening here, what's happening there, almost like a kind of handover, and it's fallen through. Now, these are sometimes maybe just the margins, Cammy, and if that doesn't fall through, if there's one stumbling block, or, let's say it is Thirlwell, and, they say, like, we know that's a mistake, he'll go in time, we can't make that happen immediately, that's crazy, but, work something out, and, Gerrard is happy to, see out the rest of the season with that kind of arrangement, and maybe it's changed this summer, whatever it may be. Let's say it's done. That means that deal's done tail end of last week. And we're talking a completely different game. We're talking about how smooth it's been, how decisive it's been, how the owners have come in and taken charge. And that's a different situation from the chief exec and director of football who handled the last one. And again, you've got, the last one was dragged out way beyond what was necessary. People been left hanging by a thread, believing they were going to get it and didn't. The same's happened here. So it could so easily have been, this has been really swift and decisive and we're back on track and we've got the guy that most of the fans want. And I think they expected that, Cammy, to be honest. And when that hasn't happened, for whatever reason, it's just been scrambling about. And that, again, unprepared for that eventuality, clearly, because we're still at, Thursday lunchtime. Who knows what will happen, by the time this goes out. But it's exactly that. It's pure scrambling around, and Danny Rowe being effectively just kept on a thread until he cut it. Both processes, the summer one and this one, have not been particularly. It doesn't look particularly good, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they've not been well executed, and there's a part of me, I suppose, I'm trying to remain relatively neutral in terms of this, and it's probably there's a part of me that I try and purposefully not get swept up into like the online fervor that kind of comes about where Gerrard was certainly, like I said, the vast majority of people I'd spoken to was their choice, and there was a part of me that thought, okay, right, well, I do get it and it makes sense. It connects the dots. But how much are you willing to give away the store? And I think you would be in agreement with me. I'd said it in the breaking news pod after it came out that Gerrard wasn't taking the role, that I don't believe he walks into the room unless he's got a real, legitimate interest in taking the job. I think if he wanted to discount himself away from it, he would have been nowhere near it. So I think as soon as you get him in the room, you start to understand that there is definitely a desire there for him to be a very much a serious option. And then it transpires that obviously those talks broke down. The rumour mill goes into overdrive. And so you're right. I'm very interested to find out whether or not we will ever find out what caused those talks to break down. There's been all of these rumours going around that it could be the club
It's
structure.
control. It's
Yeah.
control. It's the same, ultimately the same as before, where everyone was enthralled to Stevie. Before we just didn't have the money to spend that summer after, and he had to be told, well, how about selling some assets like other clubs do? So I think it's a fair assumption that it's about control. Whether he's made some assumptions that he would get his own way and those haven't come to pass, whether he was led to believe he would get his own way and then maybe the board have corrected those, who knows? But let's assume it was around that. And you know what? I've no real issue with that in theory, even though we're in an absolute riot of a situation. I think a club's entitled to say, well, no, you're the manager. You don't
There is a
run
structure.
the whole thing.
Yeah, there is a structure that we've set in place.
But you should know that ahead of time. Another gripe is this loss of narrative. Immediately. Again, don't know the ins and outs, but I would assume that imminent, almost a done deal, all these terms, that comes from Gerrard's camp in order to put pressure on the club to, give in on certain points. And, that leaves a very happy or unhappy support when you can't get agreement. Instead of immediately and consistently briefing, we're open to other options. There is no preferred candidate, blah, 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 blah. Even if there is, just making that narrative that we're not going to be, rushed into anything, we're not going to be pushed into anything by anyone. And it's just funnily enough, talking about Gerrard wanting control. Who has control here, Cammy? Who's in control of anything at the club at the minute? It just doesn't appear that anyone is. Now, you've got absentee landlords or those kind of detached owners, which, again, I don't think is an issue. In theory, I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I see a lot of benefits from that kind of model compared to what we had before. But if you are going to be that bit detached, you have to have a chief exec who is an absolute fucking boy, who just leads the club, not the football operations, but the club. and as a political operator and as a strong leader. That's the only way that works. Because if you have a perceived vacancy there, and there is a more than perceived vacancy there, then the detachment becomes a problem. And in the same way that the football structure, I don't have an issue with a head coach at Rangers. I don't think that's a problem because it's how football is going. And we'll maybe touch on how special or otherwise Rangers is. But I don't have an issue with that if the director of football is the leader of the football operations. And he's visible, he's accountable, he's charismatic, you have confidence in that. There's a good piece in The Athletic, I think, last week about directors of football in Britain being kind of in the shadows, whereas in Germany, they're in mixed zones and they take ownership of the football operations as they should. That's the whole point. And the head coach does just deal with stuff in the grass, and that's their job. And clearly, Russell Martyn was a wrong appointment on many levels. But Rangers appointed a head coach and left him to operate like the gaffer. And that's just not how it's supposed to work. So there's just this lack of leadership everywhere. Who's the king? Who do we have any trust and confidence in, being able to shut a toilet seat properly? That's really the problem. Everything just feels like a vacuum at the moment. And it's difficult. There's this really interesting conversation, debate going on at the end of last season, just before the takeover. And I didn't really get involved. I wrote something kind of after I read a lot. I quite enjoyed reading a lot about it. But again, is Rangers really a special club? Should we actually just start operating like every normal club that's out there? And I came to that unsatisfactory conclusion, Cammy, I guess, that it's both. If thousands and thousands of people have expectations and demands and are very vocal about those demands, that this is special, here's what needs to happen, then it is. But the trick with leadership, whether that's CEO leadership, director of football leadership, or you do go back to that old Rangers model, I guess, of the gaffer, Walter, really, in a new form, even though guys like that don't really exist anymore. But let's say they did. And there's a hell of a lot of projection of wish fulfillment onto what Gerrard brings, but that's another story. Then the trick that these guys have, I guess, is that they wear that noise and that pressure and that circus in ways that the players don't have to. And they are able to get into players' heads that this is just about football. Just do your job. You are better than Hibs. You are better than Hearts. Forget the noise. That will go away as a byproduct of results. And that's the trick to these guys. That's why they're so good. They can just remind them that it is still about your job and you're better at your job than the other people in the league, which is why 55, I think, happened the way that it did. And that noise wasn't there. The first Old Firm game of that season being the best example of that circus, all that stuff didn't exist, and it was just about football. Going to notoriously tricky away grounds where the opposition couldn't feed off a volatile and visceral home support. And it just became brass tacks. It just became about the football itself. And you could just see that Rangers team just saying, oh, we're better than all this. We'll be fine. Now, that's obviously very, very unique circumstances, but that's what good leadership does. It just reminds everybody that noise is there. We have to deal with it. Don't worry, I will. But just remember, you've got a job to do. You're better than the other people doing that job, and just focus on the small. And no one's leading, Cammy. No one's leading at all.
And I think the point around the director of football setup, there's a part to that which I think, and you kind of touched on it there, and you talk about it as part of being, Rangers being a special club, and I think part of it's generational, because when you think about the last 50 years or so, and you're talking about the managers that we've had, and they were the figurehead. And I think now that, as you say, like even within mainland Europe and how they operate the director of football model, I don't subscribe to the thing, and I have seen this in a few places where it feels like because we're so adverse to it that a director of football position can't work in Britain. I don't agree with that. I think it can. I think that it will take time in order to be able to bed in, because I think that there has to be a degree of a culture shift within clubs and fans, and we are very much a really good example of this, where if you can, and you kind of touched on this, but where you can draw those lines of responsibility, and your control over them, then you can start to break that up and fragment it a little bit so that you fundamentally know where you begin and stop. Right? That's fine. I
Yeah,
understand that comes
and
into
it's
it,
the
but
personalities though, Cammy. Look at the German model, right? Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, Uli Hoeneß, Matthias
it's
Sammer.
Beckenbauer and all
Boys,
that. Do you know what I mean?
it's guys who have done it and then have gone away and I was going to say do their badges, but do some learning, some degrees or whatever they need to do from a kind of business perspective, and marry the two up. But they are unquestionably, that's where the buck stops from a football operation at Bayern or Dortmund or wherever. And that's what we don't, not just at Rangers, just really have it in Britain. A lot of technocrats, a lot of guys who've come through the FA or whatever, and they don't inspire that same kind of confidence, responsibility, control, leadership. And so it's not the structure really. It's the fans don't have confidence in the people who are in place in these structures, and that's definitely the case here.
And yeah, and I think that when you talk about how it can look versus what it needs to look like, those are separate conversations. But let's circle back to the current situation. And rumours are, abounding that the setup may be now that Kevin Muscat is across at Port Shanghai, who are close to finishing their domestic league. They are very much in the running for being able to win that league. The latest that we have heard so far is that if Muscat's offered the job, he may not be here until potentially close to the end of November, with Neil McCann initially coming in to run the first team, and then establish a position within Muscat's coaching positions when he then takes over. That has not met with a warm reception. Again, I think when you speak to people, the key focus is the amount of games that we have and the critical nature of some of those games. The European ones, obviously, the League Cup semi-final against Celtic is the first weekend in November. It feels a lot to me like we can negotiate, and as we've already said, you can negotiate in terms of what you need to be able to try and do. If Muscat decides, or Rangers decide on his behalf, that actually that setup will not work and we need him in immediately, and he then decides to decline the offer, this circus will continue to rumble on, because Danny Role has obviously removed himself out of it. I kind of understand where Danny Role's come from, because
Totally
it
understand
was,
why.
but I get that to a point, but I also think that you sometimes, and we've all done it, right? I've been involved in recruitment for over 20 years. And you have your preferred choice. You have the person that you want to go out and make the offer to. But if you can't make that deal happen, then you do have second, third options that you want to be able to try and go to. And that's not a new thing, certainly within modern football. However, Role has obviously then sidestepped over it. It would not surprise me if within the next few days he gets announced somewhere else. I think he was getting linked with Monaco and other places as well. That might be a more likely deal for him. So I'm hoping that he hasn't, spat his dummy out because of the Gerrard conversations. Fundamentally, Rangers need to make a deal happen, and they need to be able to make it quickly, because this vacuum that we have at the moment is just starting to, if it's possible, drive further disengagement from the fans. We wanted bodies back in. I think it said on our show before Gerrard stepped out of the process, if Gerrard signs, Saturday would have been a sellout. I've got zero doubt in my mind for that. But as things stand at the moment, we are just going to run in this neutral lack of progress that's not going to be able to get the fans back on side. And I've got no idea what would happen if that plan came true. Neil McCann takes over, what we would see. But worst case scenario, we continue with lackluster performances and worse results. Muscat stepping into an absolute cauldron. And I absolutely believe that at some point, focus would shift either between the board for not making him the offer and getting him here now, or for him delaying coming and getting us into an even worse position. So all of a sudden, you're now back, and I wouldn't even call it, square one, because you're actually behind in terms of what you need to then do to get the fans on board with you.
Oh, aye. I mean, again, it's wasting the international break that they had clearly planned to wait and use. And it's just so avoidable, Cammy. It's not like you talking about recruitment. Can you shorten your notice? Can you get away with that? Can do a deal with your other employer? Are you interested? Great, okay. But are you willing to come because we need you immediately? No, don't worry about it then. That's a quick conversation. Now, what tempts someone away from that? Because it isn't a fixed thing. It's until I win the league. Well, we don't know when that's going to be. So it's just a non-starter that, as far as I'm concerned, either willing to come now or don't worry about it. Now he'll be on a bonus, I'm sure, for winning that title. Again, that should be the second question then. Would Rangers be prepared to cover that? Because money talks, right? And there would be a number at which point he would say, right, okay, see you after. I'll make that move. That's understandable negotiation, but again, there's time. The clock's ticking on that. So they've wasted the time where that has any kind of worth. For the reasons that you've mentioned, so it's just yet another just disaster class, another completely avoidable situation, because we must have known, or we should have known, what his intentions would be, how much it would cost to change those intentions, and act accordingly. And you're absolutely right. Saturday is just going to be kind of more of the same, and you obviously feel for Stephen Smith being in that situation. Neil McCann is well liked, so he may get about 10 minutes with the Rangers support of goodwill. But he's, in terms of being a head coach or a manager or taking that complete responsibility, his CV does not exactly set the heart racing with respect to that. Not saying that he couldn't do a vital job on a coaching staff. I think he absolutely could. So it's just one disaster to another. Again, rooted in some just bad decisions, obviously going way back to the summer. And for all the good intention, for all the structure, if you don't get your director of football right, a lot of that just kind of comes crumbling down. And in this particular fortnight that we're talking about, you better be sure that deal, that your first choice can be done, is done, before you start, ripping up anything else. And I go back to what I said before, it's one of, if not the biggest disappointment relative to hope and expectation and assumptions. And I don't think they were ridiculous assumptions, by the way. And I think most of us shared them. It's been a disaster.
And the Muscat deal for me now has to happen, because, to be honest with you, I'm terrified about what we on now, Plan D, is going to be, if he decides then that actually the terms that Rangers present to him aren't suitable. And it's as I say, I'd love to be a fly in the wall when we're having these conversations with him, because I would love to know who's holding the power here. If he's smart enough, he'll probably realise he has the larger percentage, because we, as I say, I've got no idea as to who comes into it next. As I say, I've tried to kind of stay out of a lot of the names that were linked into it, because they've been wide and far. And the ones that seem to have gained some traction, obviously, the three that we've spoken about. No idea who the fourth is. Genuinely don't. Now, you could, if you were incredibly optimistic, and I applaud you for this if this is your mindset, but you could turn around and say, well, you know what, we could get someone else and they could come in to be a success. And we could pull a diamond from the rough. But I think that's all ifs and buts. And what scares me about that potential option is pretty much everything that we've been talking about in terms of the preparation, the execution, who's making the decision. Does time now become a factor? Because if we are suggesting that McCann comes in as interim and then Muscat steps in once all of this nonsense is finished, grand. But if he then decides, right, well, we can't go for that, then are we at a point where we have to find someone who's immediately available now, and they then think, well, the time issue now isn't a problem, so therefore we can just get someone in ASAP, and the fans will have to swallow it, and no one's going to be fooled.
But
by
that's
that.
leadership. Sorry, Cammy, that's leadership. That's going okay. We're at Muscat, and I don't believe that Kevin Muscat, if he did not play for Rangers at some point and wasn't Australian and managing in the Far East, would be on that radar personally, given what Celtic had done. And I'm not really sure he's on the radar in terms of their original plan, vision for the style and kind of long-term future of the club. It is the second option after Gerrard of appeasing the fan noise and trying to calm that down. That's all that is. Danny Roll, I think, is your next option within the same kind of structure as I see it. But I think they knew after Gerrard's collapse that would go down like a cup of cold six. So it's whizzing about between those 2 points with no real assuredness. And I'm not trying to downplay and simplify a complex process. I know there are plenty of bits to get through and points to be haggled on. But fundamentally, I go back to those two questions. Can you come? Are you willing to come now? If not, don't worry about it. In my opinion, we can't wait for someone, with all due respect, to be finishing a Chinese season when we're in this particular mess. And if it would take a number to get you there, what is that number? You've got until tomorrow. See you after. Because you're absolutely right. Our flailing about leaves him absolutely with the control in terms of haggling, in terms of negotiation. So it's not dynamic. It's not clear. It's everything that we get frustrated. Everything that we look at other clubs around the world and criticise them for when they're flying about between managers who are very different and would need a structure that's very different. And it just shows that there's not a lot of joined up thinking. There was, I imagine, in the abstract back in the summer, but at this club, all that theory kind of goes out the window when reality hits, and I think they've panicked, and all the signs of a kind of flailing and struggling group of people under pressure, a pressure that they just, I don't think, had really anticipated or understood was possible. And it's as big a mess as we've had certainly since returning back to the top flight. It was avoidable, and I guess that's what makes it the harder to swallow.
And I think that's where, if it's a financial issue, right, because we discussed the idea of Gerrard could have been structural, right? So that I kind of understand, because you are in a position where you want to stick to your guns and you don't necessarily want to be able to make those changes, stand by current employee. I get all of that, right? I do actually understand the kind of business orientation of coming to that decision. If it's a financial one, then I agree with you. I think that you get a number and you get them to pay it because I there's a part of me almost applauds the fact that Muscat. I don't think it's anything to do with actually winning the league. I don't think it puts another feather in his cap. I think he probably feels a deep-rooted sense of loyalty to his current employers, and there's a part of that value that I kind of recognise. I've done the same thing whenever I've moved roles. I've not left the shop in a worse condition than when I found it, and I've not downed tools when I've been working out my notice period. But ultimately, you've hit the nail on the head. You're not talking here about winning the Bundesliga. You're not talking about being able to say, well, this is a really, really significant milestone in my managerial career to date. But the other thing is as well, and this is maybe where it might feel a little bit like an open goal with the board with a significant PR problem, is if you can pay to get rid of that problem, maybe it helps you get onto the right track from a more positive PR perspective. And when I say that, I don't think for a single minute that all previous sins will be forgiven. I think it's going to take a long time and a number of wins to be able to get them into the plus column. But this is where it feels to me like if this is the main point and we are haggling purely over finance, and we don't know that for sure, but let's say that it is, pay the money, let's get everything calmed down and get the fires put out, and let's just move on. Let's just get something, set in structure, and then at that point we can just progress ideally. And I think that's what the fans want more than anything. If you are going to haggle with this and he has the power to be able to walk away, and again, like you say, you don't have alternate options in there, okay, maybe Roll does come back to the table. I've got no idea. But as things stand to now, you have, for me, an acceptable win in front of you. And I think you have to be able to take it, given, as I say, the current feeling of the fans towards your board.
Because the failure to do that again just leads to this feeling of incompetence and unable to get things done. And go back to the player issue we've not even discussed. I still think I've been pretty consistent on this. The main issue at Rangers, which is regardless who you get in and when they get them in, clearly the squad that we have is underperforming and it has levels way, way, way above what we've seen. But I still don't think it has the leadership throughout it that is required on the pitch, because managers are, quite constrained once the games actually start. They need their guys there. And we've said this long and weary that Rangers have struggled for on-pitch leadership. And that hasn't changed. So whoever comes in, we're still asking them to not quite perform miracles, but really get tunes out of players that I'm not convinced can do it without two or three better players around them. So it's just from the recruitment in the summer to the second managerial recruitment phase within 3 months. It's just this sign that we can't really do anything right. We can't get things done. And as I said,
and that problem is not solved in January, for my money, because I think the January window is very much hit or miss. So now what you're talking about is moving that into next summer in order to be able to get that recruitment where it needs to be.
Christ knows how we finish this up before we even get to next summer, and what goodwill is lost. And, is it fan anger or fan apathy? Fan apathy is far worse. You just get people going, you know what? Looking at the receipts over the last few years and the flights and the hotels and the petrol and whatever else, I could spend this other ways. And you would imagine that really would be disconcerting to an ownership who I can only assume wants to sell us things and sell us things at big prices, but they need to put something on the pitch that gets that, because I've said this before in other shows, I think this is an exhausted Rangers support. and that just doesn't have patience. Doesn't have patience the best of times, but really has none. And beyond anger in a few cases, I think, and a lot more than people maybe want to admit. I think there's quite a few that could well just kind of chuck it if they don't see competence, if they don't see a clear plan that they believe in. More importantly, people executing that plan that they believe in and have confidence in. And that has to happen at various levels of the club immediately. Otherwise, there could be a bit of a cliff edge here, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, listen, that will do us for this week on Extra. We wish Stevie Smith all the best as he steps into the dugout, a role which I'm very certain he wasn't expecting to have to take on Saturday afternoon against Dundee United. But yeah, as I say, hopefully we will be able to get 3 points against them. I'm not a huge lover of Dundee United at the best of times, so even being able to beat them will just make me feel slightly better, but it'll also be a good chance for us to be able to get another 3 points on the board and rectify our league position as well. David will be back with you on Monday on the flagship to unpack that. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I say that at the end of every show, but I'm going to be honest with you. I really do mean it genuinely this week for sticking by us, because Martyn surmised it perfectly there. There is a lot of anger. There's patience, I think, hasn't even close to been able to try and return to us. And I think for me, the general mood of the fans is just a lack of energy and enthusiasm. But we would like to thank you on behalf of myself, Martyn, and all the rest of the podders for being able to stick by us. And hopefully we've had a great conversation, and I've really enjoyed it in terms of the current state of play. We can't put glitter in a jobby, as the Scottish saying goes. But if you'd like to hear more from us, and you will, whenever at some point this year we decide to announce a manager, you'll be able to join us at patreon.com/heart and hands to be able to hear that the instant that we have any kind of form of confirmation. Martyn, thank you for coming on. As I say, I made a bit of a joke at the start of it that always feels like we pull you out for these things, but thank you for what I think has been a brilliant chat about the current state of affairs.
I'd love to say it was a joy, but you know what I mean. Yeah, no worries, Cammy.
Thanks, folks. We'll be back with you on Monday, and I'll be back with you next Thursday. Thanks very much for listening. Bye-bye.